Have you ever played through a really good story in a game or experienced some sort of thought and emotion-provoking narrative? That is due to an empathic response that the narrative has prompted within the player. I think that this is important because empathy is at the base of what creates a great narrative. That human connection to the story and the ability to connect with characters and keep playing to find out what happens next to them. If a narrative can't evoke a strong empathic response, then the purpose to keep playing can be lost. It is hard to stay connected to a narrative that you are not emotionally invested in. Having said this, I think games like Cyberpunk 2077 do a great job at hooking the player and keeping them playing mission after mission. Video games build empathy through immersing the player with interesting characters, strong world building, and creating an extensive narrative with various dialogue options leading to a sense of player agency. A major part of feeling connected to a narrative is being able to relate to the characters that exist in the world. Whether you're connected to the player character or the non-player characters, each one of these relationships matter. In Cyberpunk 2077, the player character can be customized in depth to allow the player to play the game as the person they want to be. This can be a character that represents them and has similar physical features, or it can be a character that looks completely different but is still created at the discretion of the player. In both cases, this detailed customization creates a connection between the player and the player character. This connection leads to a stronger feeling of immersion. In an article by Bonnie Ruberg, she notes that empathy and immersion are often associated, as immersion creates the ability to engage an audience and invite them to step into an imaginary world. In this sense, it is easier to feel for the characters as you feel like you are right there with them. In the Corporal Life Path, the first few hours of the game are spent getting to know V's best friend, Jackie Wells. In the other two life paths, you meet him in different ways, but the story continues similarly. In these first few hours, the narrative works to create a connection between the player character and Jackie through missions where you get to know him personally. Towards the end of those first few hours of gameplay, you are both hired by Dexter Deshawn to retrieve a chip called the Relic. During this mission, Jackie is shot and dies in the getaway car right beside V. This leaves V evidently heartbroken and full of guilt.
See you in the major leagues, Jack.
The game creates a great sense of empathy by building up a strong and personal relationship between the player character and Jackie, so the loss V is feeling almost feels like the player's loss as well. In this sense, it becomes very easy to empathize with V. Sean Gallagher would call this the interpersonal similarity condition, which is when empathy is created when the empathizer's affective states stand in a similar relation to each other. In this case, the player and V both have a connection with Jackie, and both felt the impact when he died. Now, throughout the game, the player will come across characters that have their own smaller storylines that fit into the larger scheme of the game. It is through these stories that the player character begins to build relationships with characters like Judy Alvarez and Goro Takamura. The narrative subtly forces these relationships with the player character, which ends up with us empathizing with their causes and caring about what happens to them.
I let her down. I thought if I gave her some space or time, she'd get back on her feet.
I don't know what to say. Never was any good at this stuff.
Oh, you don't need to talk. Did more for her than anyone else.
Now, let's take a look at Johnny Silverhand, the second player character in the game besides V. Johnny Silverhand is living in V's head, after the relic gets implanted in his skull. If the relic is forcefully removed, V dies. Johnny Silverhand is almost like a virus, as over the course of the game, V is challenged with figuring out a way to remove the chip before Johnny gains full control. Since these two are forcefully intertwined, they get to know each other over the course of the story. At first, Johnny is rough around the edges, but as time goes on, they figure out they can help each other out in different ways. V is on a mission to get this dead guy Johnny out of his head, while at the same time, Johnny sees this as an opportunity to fix some past relationships. We run into characters from Johnny's past who are still around, and through these interactions, we learn more about Johnny's struggles. This begins to open up his character and become more emotionally connected. This also creates a unique relationship where we as the player, who also have Johnny in our head, know these people, but to them they see a stranger. They see V. Through this process, we begin to understand the empathy that grows between the two of them, and as a result, the empathy that grows between the player and Johnny. Gallagher notes that empathy is founded on our capacity to recognize that others are similar to us, but to do so without confusing ourselves with the other. This quote is ironic because Johnny is living in V's head, and this relationship causes them to become more empathetic towards each other. The narrative forces them to work together to survive, which causes them to bond.
But I've managed one thing for now. Not to fuck this up. What we have.
It's been a long, bumpy road, but we made it.
At times, V lets Johnny take over to speak with old friends and make things right with people from his past. Not only do we as the player begin to feel connected to these characters, but we see more and more how the two characters start to understand each other more and empathize with one another. The next key tool in helping a narrative immerse a player to build empathy is world building. A narrative may introduce us to very impactful characters, but the world those characters exist in can impact how we relate and feel about them as well. Cyberpunk's Night City is vital to the importance of the characters. The city shapes who they are and what they do. Without Night City, the characters we meet along the way, such as Jackie, Judy, Johnny, and others, would only be shells of yet-to-be-fulfilled beings. As Gallagher says, an essential part of empathizing with these characters is understanding the context of their situations. He calls this the caring condition. Even if we the player do not care about certain characters, empathy requires that we at least be concerned or take some interest in the experiences of those characters. Night City forces this upon the player since the world building already does a great job at giving us a sense of what each of these characters' stories are. This is based on the density of the city that we explore, where we can find wealthy business districts with skyscrapers, and then dark gritty streets with food vendors and crime that are lined with apartments stacked on top of each other. The city is littered with details for the player to pay attention to or interact with. As the player, we can free roam and explore the city, or we can grab a bite to eat. The player can use the washroom, admire themselves in the mirror, or go to the bar for a drink. Not only are there things like this to interact with, but the city itself is full of little details that add on to this immersion. The lighting and color schemes of the city add this dark and futuristic atmosphere in areas where it's important, while at the same time, there are areas of skyscrapers that glimmer and shine in the sunlight. This ability to explore the city and become immersed through details like this help our understanding of the narrative and the characters that we meet along the way. Now, let's bring it back to Johnny Silverhand.
Oh shit!
His backstory actually helps the world building process, while at the same time giving us more information about Johnny and his life. During flashbacks, Johnny becomes the player character, and we get to experience parts of his life that show us what Night City looked like and felt like in the past. We get a glimpse into the state of the city, the country, and the corporate powers that Johnny's hellbent on collapsing. His backstory helps the narrative to provide the player with more context to why Night City is the way it is today. Along the way, we learn more about Johnny and his fight, causing V and us the player to understand him more.
The terrorists stating their desire to, quote-unquote, topple a monument to corporate colonialism.
The last feature I want to touch on is dialogue options that enhance the feeling of player agency. The narrative is one of the most important parts of a game and is the aspect that intertwines the characters and world together. But in RPG-style games like Cyberpunk 2077, dialogue options are the narrative tool that provide the character with a sense of player agency that makes them feel like they are having more of an impact on the game. In truth, they are. Some choices of dialogue will alter how the story plays out and will affect the final outcome in some instances. But dialogue choices also help create immersion, therefore helping to build empathy. Now, let me explain. Players are given a choice at different times with how they want to approach situations. In some cases, the player can be confrontational, and in other cases, the player can be friendly. This decision can matter on how the player feels towards the character they're making a choice about. A good example of this is when the player is tasked with confronting a good cop who has been digging into her dirty cop co-workers and their illegal activities. She's made enemies and her life is in danger. You confront her and are given the option to attack her or find a solution. The solution would allow her to live and get out of town.
Stop! Not one more fucking step!
Anna, drop this investigation. It's in your best interest.
That a threat? I'd remind you, you're the one in the fucking crosshairs.
Hey, easy. I just want to help.
This example shows how the player's feelings towards a character can affect the outcome. Since she's doing work for a good cause, it gives the player the guilt of killing her if they do so. You feel empathy for this character, who only wants to do good but is in a position where everyone is out to get her. In a sense, dialogue options give the player empathetic options. The game actually provides clear choices to be empathetic to a character's cause. All in all, empathy is an emotion that, when tapped into, can create a great immersive experience in a game. The combination of impactful characters, strong world building, and great writing worked into dialogue options all allow the player to empathize with characters in the game. The immersion created in a great game can only be as great as the player's empathic reaction.
I just want the world to know that I was here. That I mattered.